The content you're about to hear may be graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
So by the time we get to this one, we're like 20 episodes in, and we put together all of this content. And I always wonder, am I going to mess up and we're going to have duplicate episodes from something we've done in the past? And I realized how many wrongful conviction cases there are. I don't know if you've ever just gone and looked at a list of them. There's so many of them. I would say this ranks up there in being one of the most tragic ones. It's an older case. And I do want to say ahead of time that there's a lot of sources to this one. Victims of the State is a source, Orlando Sentinel, the Miami Herald, the Daytona Beach Morning Journal, the Death Penalty Center for Information, the Journal of American Legal Studies, the New Times out of Broward, Palm Beach, early Reuters. I think I said the Palm Beach Post, Boca Raton News, Sarasota Herald Tribune, and of course the National Registry of Exonerations plays into this one. This case is a Florida case, and it's from 1967. Had you ever heard of this one before?
No, I hadn't.
It comes out of DeSoto County, Florida, Arcadia specifically. This is a multiple murder charge. Its reported crime date is 1967. And the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator, who was later exonerated, they're convicted in 1968 and they're sentenced to death. The contributing factors to this were perjury or false accusation and official misconduct. There was no DNA that contributed to the exonerations here. But the person we're talking about today is a black male who at the time of the reported crime was 31 years old. And I got to be honest, this case is absolutely horrifying as a parent. Crime itself kind of goes like this. On October 25th of 1967, 7 children, ranging in age from 2 to 8, they consumed food poisoned with paraffin. 6 of the children end up dying that day. And the 6 kids that died that day are Betty, who is age 8, Alice, who's age 7, Susie, who's age 6, Doreen, who is age 5, Vanessa, who is age 4, James Jr., who is age 2, and the 7th child, Diane, who was 3 years old, died the next day. There's so many children here.
So all of them died?
Yeah, all of them ended up dying.
Okay.
Yeah. These children belong to a woman named Annie Mae Richardson and her husband, who is James Joseph Richardson. Now, Betty and Alice were from Annie Mae's previous marriage, so they're the oldest, Betty and Alice are. The other 5 kids, James Joseph Richardson is the father. The night before, Annie Mae Richardson had prepared lunch for these kids, and the lunch was made up of beans, rice, and grits. This meal that she prepares, it gets placed in a locked refrigerator overnight, and in the morning, the Richardsons leave and go to work. They work in the orange groves about 16 miles away from their home. They have a neighbor named Bessie Reese, and Bessie Reese comes over to help take care of the kids while James and Annie Mae go to work. The 4 older kids, so Betty, Alice, Susie, and Doreen, they're enrolled in school, but they come home for lunch. In the afternoon, when they head back to school after lunch, their teachers noticed that they were showing some strange symptoms. The teacher contacts the principal, and the principal immediately takes these kids to the hospital. Thinking about the other kids, one of the teachers from the school, they go to the house to check on the other kids, and they find that they are showing the same symptoms. So they take, between the school and home, all 7 kids end up going to the hospital. And Bessie Reese and the teacher make sure that someone goes to talk to the parents to let them know that one of their children is ill and that they need one of the parents to come to the hospital. So James and Annie Mae, they leave the groves and they head to the hospital. They don't realize that it's not one of their children. It's all 7 of them. And by the time they take off for the hospital, 6 of their 7 children are already dead. One of the officers from the Arcadia Police Department, who's the first to arrive at the hospital, is a guy named Joseph Minoffen. He determines that all of these sick kids are from the same family. So he goes to their home, which is an apartment building, and the idea is he wants to search for and find and quarantine any potential poison that might be in the house. When he gets to the apartment, he doesn't find anything that seems like it would be poisonous, except for an insect spray. And reading the ingredients, he did not believe that it could have been the cause of the children's poisoning. So he goes back to the hospital. Arcadia Police Chief Richard Bernard and the DeSoto County Sheriff, who at the time was Frank Klein, they then join law enforcement officers in looking around the apartment. And Joseph Minoffen, he comes back for a second examination, and he finds other officers there. The sheriff and the police chief go into this apartment, and they notice that there's a very strong smell, but they don't find any sign of poison. Sheriff Klein believes that the poison could potentially be a pesticide. So he goes behind the apartment building to this maintenance shed that's back there, and he searches there, but he doesn't find any poison there either. As news starts to spread that all of these children from this one family are in the hospital and dying, reporters start to come to this area to cover this breaking news. Now, Arcadia, Florida is a tiny place at the time. Even today, I think as of 2020, it had about 7,200 people thereabouts. It's a very small place. It is a city inn and the county seat of DeSoto County, Florida. When the reporters start coming in, the police chief and the law enforcement officers, they are asked a lot of questions about what's going on, and they don't make any preliminary statements. There's a prosecuting attorney for DeSoto County. He does come and he responds to the reporters. He gives them some accounts of what's going on with the investigation at the house. The next morning, after the death of the last child, Diane, who was the 3-year-old, a 2-pound sack of a substance called parathion, Parathion, is discovered in the shed. So the police chief and the sheriff and all of the people that are working with them, including the prosecuting attorney, they agree that this bag had not been there the day before. And the premises had been thoroughly searched multiple times by multiple law enforcement officers from, at this point, what is essentially 3 agencies, because you've got the prosecuting attorney's office, you've got the county sheriff's office, and you've got the city police. They're all searching this apartment. They've searched this shed. It wasn't there. They think that whoever has placed this sack of this substance there is probably the person who ended up poisoning these children. There are conflicting reports on how it was found and how it ends up in the hands of law enforcement. Minoffen, the first officer that had arrived, he ends up being told by Bessie Reese, who is essentially the babysitter, that Charlie Smith, who's a resident of Arcadia's quarters, has discovered this sack of poison. So when he goes to ask Bernard, who called in this discovery to the police station, he's then informed by the police chief that it came as an anonymous mail caller's tip to the station. The next day, the police chief and John Treadwell III, who is the prosecuting attorney's local assistant, they come out and tell reporters that James Joseph Richardson had been discussing insurance policies for the children the night before their deaths. Somehow, it's determined that the insurance salesman, George Purvis, had talked to Richardson just hours before the children were poisoned. And according to authorities and the statements they released to the press, James Richardson and George Purvis give conflicting stories on these policies. For a couple of days, there's no additional evidence found, and there's no more releases. On Sunday, they hold a funeral for the children. And obviously, Annie Richardson and James Richardson are devastated that they have lost all 7 children. This funeral with these 7 kids makes national news. Magazines pick it up, television picks it up, radio networks cover this funeral. This puts Sheriff Klein at the center of nationwide attention. And Chief Barnard later tells attorney Mark Lane that Klein saw this as a chance to make a big name for himself, and he needed to make an arrest real bad. As far as I can tell, this becomes like an early super cop situation. Does that make sense?
Well, I don't know that it's early as much as it is more broadly focused because there was nationwide attention. But I think that there have been super cops since the beginning of time, so to speak. And it's just, I mean, everybody has that innate desire, right?
Yeah, they want to solve a thing. They want to be the hero.
Sure. And if you do that for your career, it becomes even more amplified and you could find yourself in a position to do so, right?
I would agree with that, yeah. 2 days after this funeral on Sunday, Sheriff Klein charges James Richardson with murder in the first degree. Police Chief Bernard points out that there's just no case against this man. That's his words, and he's talking about James Richardson. Treadwell, he is the one who's going to have to prosecute this if the case goes to trial. But from his perspective, he's looking at it just like Police Chief Bernard. So the murder warrants end up being dropped, but they're going to hold the Richardsons and formally charge them with child neglect. All right, so these policies they're talking about, digging into this for a second. George DeSoto had been talking to the family over a couple of days about getting $500 policies on each of the children, $1,000 policy on Anne, and then a $2,000 policy on James. So these are not, like, it's a lot of money for the time, it's a lot of money for this family, but it's really not that much money in the grand scheme of things. When they drop this in terms of the murder warrant and they bring up the child neglect, they create a crazy situation. So the murder warrants end up being dropped. They've charged both the Richardsons formally with child neglect. So they end up with a coroner's inquest being summoned to substantiate evidence already on hand. So you've got kind of two factions developing here. On one side, you have the assistant, James Treadwell, and Police Chief Bernard. On the other side, you have the sheriff, Frank Klein, and then you have Judge Hayes, who's going to come into all of this. At a press conference, after they've tried to figure out how to charge these people, just days after the funeral, in fact, they end up with Frank Klein announcing that for some reason he says James Richardson had 5 other children dying under mysterious circumstances in another Florida city. And he says at this press conference that the motive was to collect this insurance money on the children. He says at the time that it would total almost $14,000. Judge Hayes, joining with Frank Klein, he says that both James Richardson and his wife Annie had taken lie detector tests. The results had showed that James Richardson had knowledge of the poisoning. And as far as he was concerned, it indicated that James Richardson was guilty. The coroner's jury, they hold a hearing on November 2nd of 1967. I'm emphasizing that for a second because it happens in such a quick period of time. Basically, the only thing that happened between these children dying and the coroner's jury and all these press conferences is a funeral and Halloween. So Judge Hayes says at this coroner's jury, we're meeting today to instruct Sheriff Frank Klein to file murder charges against James Richardson. This statement, because of him being a prominent citizen and a judge in Arcadia, this tiny place, with this handpicked jury of local people, it carries considerable weight. Judge Hayes had been a judge in Arcadia for more than 30 years at this. So pretty much no matter what's happening here, there's going to be a trial. We end up with Frank Klein going to a grand jury. He takes the bag of poison, he takes the insurance card, and he also brings witnesses who said that James Richardson appeared unusually calm and not upset over. When he did that before this coroner's jury, we only end up with him being indicted on the charge of murdering one child. And I want to point that out because it's kind of important. Over the next week or so, 3 different jailhouse informants come forward, and they tell authorities that James Richardson had confessed to having put this poison in the children's food. A lawyer who's a 30-year-old white guy named John Robinson, he starts to read the media coverage of these Arcadia, quote, murders. And he believes that the case is being handled unfairly in the press because he sees Judge Hayes talking and realizes that Judge Hayes repeatedly and constantly claiming that James Richardson is guilty is going to affect how this case goes. So John Robinson, he reaches out to people who know the Richardson family. They tell him in these very brief interviews that he's doing about James Richardson, they say that James Richardson's a family man and they don't believe that he would or could kill his children. So then John Robinson calls up the president of the NAACP in Florida. It's a guy named Joel Atkins. He convinces Joel Atkins, who was the senior pastor of Zion Hill Ministry Baptist Church, that the NAACP chapter in Arcadia should ask James Richardson whether he wanted to be represented by them, and they could give him a list of potential lawyers. And Richardson decided that he would let the NAACP represent him. And he ends up choosing John Robinson to be his attorney. Robinson goes to talk to James Richardson while he's being held in the county jail before the trial took place. And James Richardson is adamant that he did not kill his children. And he tells Robinson that he loved his children very much and he would never do this. He also mentions to Robinson that Sheriff Klein has been pushing him around and calling him racial slurs. And in his own words, he says that he's been questioning him in a very mean way every day. Sheriff Klein had told James Richardson that he would be let off easy if he would just confess to the crime. But Richardson denied having ever harmed any of his children. So, talking to a man named Ernell Washington, who's another prisoner in the jail at the time, John Robinson discovers that Sheriff Klein has placed an eavesdropping device in James Richardson's cell. And whenever John Robinson is going in there to talk to James Richardson, he's being recorded. So Robinson finds the microphone and removes it, and he lets Sheriff Klein know that he's found it. Robinson files a writ of habeas corpus after examining the available evidence and finding nothing substantial that could indicate that James Richardson is guilty. The bond had began at $100,000, and Robinson goes about trying to contest the bond and get a lower bond set. After some negotiations, the bail is reduced down to $7,500, and Robinson is able to work with local people to get James Richardson released on bail. At trial, we have Ernell Washington, we have a man named James Weaver, and a man named James Cunningham. They had all been cellmates with Richardson in the Arcadia jail. They said that James had admitted to them that he had killed the children. Now, the judge at the time had revoked his bail, and they ordered Richardson to go back into the jail. A change of venue is requested for the trial to take place in Fort Myers. Attempts by John Robinson to move the trial to a potentially fairer county, like someplace where maybe the locals won't have as much influence, are all denied. And on May 27, 1968, in the Lee County Courthouse, the trial begins. Despite numerous challenges and all of Robinson's efforts, they end up with an all-white jury. And we kind of know how that's going to go in Florida at the time that this is happening. During the trial, the most sensational development comes from Sheriff Klein. Sheriff Klein claims that there's evidence that at least 3 of Richardson's children had been killed in another county, and a further 3 who had become ill but died. Bessie Reese gives evidence that she had divided up the meal into 7 equal parts once the children came home from school at around 5 minutes to 12. For his part, James Treadwell, who was conducting the examination of Bessie Reese, he establishes that she had been on parole at the time, but he didn't ask what charge she had been convicted on. James Treadwell did not want the jury to find out that she had been on parole for having murdered her husband. That seems like kind of a big deal to me. There's no other questions about her involvement in the preparation of this food. And when asked about finding the sack of poison, the parathion, Bessie Reese became more specific. She claimed that Charlie Smith had wanted to look for the sack and had gone straight to the shed and pulled a board off of the window, discovering the sack. She used this to imply that Charlie Smith had prior knowledge of the location of this poison. She said that an unknown woman had seen them retrieving the sack and called in to the authorities. Charlie Smith was in the courtroom during this testimony, but he was not asked to testify at the time. The next witness after Bessie Reese was Gerald Purvis. So Gerald Purvis is this insurance salesman. According to him, he had called on James Richardson and household on the 24th of October. They don't really establish in the course of this testimony whether he has been invited or if he has been out operating as a door-to-door salesman. We don't really see as many door-to-door salesmen today, but it was very prevalent at this time.
I can say with a little bit of certainty, under the other circumstances, it seems unlikely that the family invited an insurance salesman out.
I would tend to agree with you there. So he testified that he talked about the family's plans with Mr. Richardson, but that James could not pay the necessary premiums at the time. So Gerald Purvis decided that he would come back in a few weeks. Treadwell, in the course of questioning him, he insisted that Gerald Purvis had left with the impression that there would be a policy in place. But Gerald Purvis, for his part, he adamantly denies this. So next they bring on a pathologist and then they bring on a chemist. And they conclude that the children had in fact died from this organic phosphate known as parathion, and that it had been found in their stomachs and on utensils in the Richardson apartment. There are several law enforcement officers that we've already talked about that include the police chief, it includes Sheriff Klein, and includes the first on the scene, James Minoffen. They testified that they had searched the shed and that they had not seen the bag of poison there on October the 25th. Charlie Smith then testifies about finding the bag of parathion in the shed. His story lines up with Bessie Reese's, and he's quickly excused. So the jury then retires to consider the evidence. And after about a half hour of deliberations, on May 31st, 1968, they return with a unanimous verdict. So they find a unanimous verdict of guilty of death with premeditation at the hands of James Richardson and party or parties unknown. So they come back with a guilty verdict on murders for these children. They also recommend the death penalty for James Richardson. At this point in time, for some reason, Judge Hayes is recorded as having arrested Charlie Smith as a material witness and setting bond of him for $2,000. They do not arrest any other witnesses. But the idea, I think, of what they were headed for there is they were going to call Charlie Smith the party or parties unknown. Because obviously, if James Richardson is at work when all of this happens, he has to have someone to assist him in some way here. Like an unnamed co-conspirator.
Well, okay, but
It's confusing.
Well, I mean, it sort of is, but it also sort of isn't. Do you think that this was the plan all along and that's why they didn't call him as a witness?
No, they do call him as a witness. They just don't call him to back up Bessie Reese right away.
That's what I mean. Do you think that's why? Because they were going to try and... So my question is, none of the testimony that you've covered so far has had anything to do with Richardson ever having made the food, served the food, anything like that.
So the idea is that Anne made the food, and then James Richardson poisoned it, and Bessie Reese served it without knowing it had been poisoned.
Right.
They don't establish it by evidence. It's a story that the prosecutor tells and the jury believes.
I understand that. Now, one interesting part of this is it comes out as, the food was made the night before and put in a locked refrigerator.
Correct.
It's weird to lock your refrigerator.
At the time, I think it was in a more common area. So the idea was it was locked off just because it was locked off. It's not something that's all that confusing. It sounds confusing in 2024. I don't know that it would have been back then.
Sure. And I take that into consideration. But to me, it seems like, it lends more towards the fact that Anne would have realized that Joseph was poisoning the food.
Right. So Richardson is sentenced to die. After all this takes place, the police chief, Bernard, he still believes that there's no case against Richardson. He is right there with you. He does not see anything here that dignifies Richardson having been convicted and sentenced to death.
Without implicating somebody that, through the testimony given at least, had contact with the food, right?
Right.
It seems odd, but I mean, it is what it is at this point.
Well, there is some sensational stuff. I don't know if you want to go into all of that. So the jailhouse informants, the two that end up coming in to testify, there's three originally, two come in to testify. One of them said that James Richardson had been angry at his wife because she had been having an affair with Bessie Reeves, who's the babysitter. This is never verified. It's only brought about in terms of this one informant talking about it. The other informant, both of these guys had received reductions in their prison sentences, by the way. He said that James Richardson told him that he put the poison in the food. So one says he put the poison in the food. The other one says his wife was having an affair with the babysitter. The third informant before trial, this is terrible to even talk about this, but he was shot to death. But his statement was read for the jury, and it basically verified the other two statements.
What was being said about other children having been dead?
I don't even know. It doesn't come up in the paperwork here in any way that's meaningful.
I think that was just garbage.
Yeah, I think Frank Klein was a terrible sheriff, and that he's just piling it on for the press.
So, the worst combination in my research and experience in looking into cases, especially farther back cases, this is in the 60s and the 70s, even into the 80s, is a super cop wannabe and a snitch that won't quit.
Correct.
That is the worst combination ever. But it's very strange looking back on this now. It wasn't said once or twice. I think it was said 3 times that there were other children in other counties that were.
It shows up in the news media at least 18 times by my count.
Okay. And so it makes it look like this guy's having kids and killing them.
Right.
In multiple places. But that's not what happened at all, nor would that. It's ridiculous. But they skip over the part where the babysitter was suspected of killing her husband, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe she was convicted of it. I don't even know.
She was on parole for killing her husband.
Okay. And so that gets skipped over, right? But they're making up kids that Mr. Richardson had killed.
Correct. So Richardson sentenced to die. He spends the next 5 years on death row. He's ultimately saved by the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1972 in the case of Furman versus Georgia, which you and I have talked about on here before. But the holding there was, this is a huge deal in terms of the history of the death penalty, this 1972 holding. It was that the arbitrary and inconsistent imposition of the death penalty violates the 8th and 14th Amendments and would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Ultimately, while this has some changes to it over the years, in this case, it's going to save the life of James Richardson.
You know what? I actually, through our work on exoneration cases, I feel there was a whole lot of merit behind that ruling with regard to the biasness of the doling out of the death penalty to black men.
Yeah. Yeah, there have been subsequent developments since Furman versus Georgia. You could go and look at Woodson versus North Carolina, Roberts versus Louisiana, Coker versus Georgia. They've come up along with, I think we did United States versus Miller or Miller versus Alabama at one point, Kennedy versus Louisiana, Roper versus Simmons, Ford versus Wainwright. And then we did a case about intellectually disabled folks a long time ago, and that holding was Atkins versus Virginia. So we've talked about multiple different ways the death penalty has been shaped by other holdings. The one that ultimately saves the life of James Richardson is Furman versus Georgia. And he gets his sentence commuted to life in prison. And it's the same thing that we had talked about in an earlier case that's actually kind of confusing to read. His death sentence is ultimately commuted to life in prison with term parole eligibility, meaning he has to serve a certain amount of time and then he's eligible for parole. There's a guy named Mark Lane that comes into play here. He's an internationally known trial attorney and author. He had been to see James Richardson on death row, and in his opinion, many clues had been overlooked or hidden that would have pointed to James Richardson being out and out innocent. James Richardson ask Mark Lane to represent him. And Mark Lane did a pretty exhaustive investigation. And in 1970, he published findings in a book called Arcadia. His findings were, he revealed that the babysitter, Bessie Reese, was a convicted murderer. And he indicated that James Richardson and Annie Mae Richardson were innocent. At the time of the children's murders, with Reese being on parole for killing her ex-husband using poison, the prosecution had hid this fact and tried very hard to keep it from coming up at the trial. Little had been done to pursue her involvement at all with the children's deaths, including the fact that she had given them the food and that she had initially lied, saying she didn't go into the apartment that day. There's some problems with this case along the way that kind of stymie the efforts. And as of 1988, Bessie Reese is suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and she's in a nursing home in Arcadia. But according to people around her, she had confessed to the murders of these children more than 100 times. Her confessions were never taken seriously because of her having Alzheimer's. She ends up dying in 1992. The last surviving witness to James Richardson's alleged jail cell confession recanted his testimony, saying that he had been offered a lighter sentence in return for the testimony, and he felt like he needed to do it. Overall, it's determined that the investigation into the children's deaths had been inadequate. There were leads that were never pursued, critical questions that were never answered, and inconsistencies that were never resolved. A man who had been dating the prosecutor's assistant, Treadwell, he met with Mark Lane and his wife at a town meeting called End the Silence and Free James Richardson. He took one of the 3 copies of the complete original file in the case, and he gave it to Mark Lane. Lane had met with the counsel for the governor of Florida. He turned the entire file over to the governor, and he asked for a full investigation and a hearing on the Richard. So the governor at that time would have been Robert Martinez. He appointed the state's attorney from Miami-Dade County, who we all know was Janet Reno. He appointed her as a special prosecutor in an investigation. A number of months thereafter, October 25th, 1989, a hearing ends up being held in Arcadia. It's in the same courthouse where James Richardson was originally convicted 21 years earlier. So Mark Lane appears on behalf of Richardson, and Janet Reno appears on behalf of the state of Florida. Lane argues his case. Janet Reno, she agrees that there has been an injustice done here, and the wrong person has been convicted of these crimes. So during this hearing, she cites that there's been Brady material that's been withheld from the defense, and that there were 6 separate elements of exculpatory evidence that were withheld. In her opinion, she found that there was evidence of a cover-up by Sheriff Frank Klein, the state's attorney at the time, Frank Schaub, Treadwell, his assistant, as well as the local judge, Judge Hayes. So on April 25th, 1989, after looking at all of the evidence presented by both sides, they began to note inconsistencies. And they realized that 20 years ago, there had been a pretty serious injustice done in terms of whether James Richardson had received a fair trial. So retired Circuit Judge Clifton Kelly, he says that he had not received a fair trial, and he releases him into the custody of his attorneys, which included Mark Lane and local counsel. After his release in 1989, James Richardson goes to work for nutritionist Dick Gregory, who's kind of a popular personality at the time, at a health resort in Fort Walton Beach. Now, Dick Gregory had spoken out for Richardson multiple times, and he had been part of sort of a wave of celebrities that were supporting James Richardson being released. So the attorneys in this end up filing a lawsuit against DeSoto County for the wrongful prosecution of James Richardson. They settle it out for $150,000. And on August 25th of 2008, after all the legal claims have been rejected, based upon the precedent of prosecutorial immunity, James Richardson files a claim under Florida's wrongful conviction compensation law, which provides compensation for wrongful imprisonment of $50,000 a year. His life had not gone great since he'd gotten out of jail in 1989. The job at the health resort in Fort Walton Beach had ended. He suffered multiple severe heart problems, which were attributed to poor medical care in prison, stress and prison food, and grief from having lost 7 members of his family and been accused of having murdered them. He had open heart surgery in prison. Now, he and Annie Mae, she stayed with him the whole time that he was in jail. But eventually they get divorced. The settlement by the county, it ultimately ends up paying the cost of his local lawyers. Richardson had been in prison for so long that he had become eligible for Social Security by the time he was released, by the way. And in August of 1995, he had a heart attack at his home. So at this point in time, he was flown out to Wichita, Kansas to be looked at to see if there was something they could do for him. He has emergency treatment there. He ends up getting an angioplasty. And one of the people that's involved in that is Dr. Joseph Galatia. He ends up offering Richardson a job as a caretaker on his ranch. He lives on his ranch for the next 18 years, but he ends up passing away in Wichita in September of 2023 at the age of 87. One of the things I found really interesting about this case, and then I'll get your thoughts on the case overall. In 2014, Rick Scott signed into law House bill known as 227, which provided compensation to a wrongfully incarcerated person who was convicted and sentenced prior to December 31st, 1979, who would otherwise be exempt from other state provisions for compensation because the case had been reversed by a special prosecutor's review and a null prosecute rather than being overturned by a court. Does that make sense?
Yes.
The law was so narrowly circumscribed that it was likely that James Richardson will be the only individual to ever be eligible for compensation under it. He was expected to receive $1.2 million for it. In 2016, he receives his first check toward compensation, which would total $50,000 a year for each year of his wrongful imprisonment. There was one place that you could go and watch about this. There's a documentary film. I think it's actually on YouTube now, but it's called Time Simply Passes. And it's telling the story of his life while he's waiting for the vote to give him compensation and to sign this into law. This case made me so angry. Just throwing that out there.
Why?
This guy lost 7 children in a day and got put in jail for their murder.
I feel like it may be the most drastic case of, the day that changed everything. Mm-hmm. That we see sort of just kind of casually presented.
Yeah.
So you don't normally hear about 7 children dying all at once, for the most part, of the same family.
You don't. It is very, very rare.
There's a lot about this case that just on its face, if you could pick. You can be the police chief, you can be the judge, you could be the sheriff, whoever you want to be. You can be the reporter or the insurance salesman. It doesn't really matter. But if you're a bystander here and you hear that, what's the very first thing that comes to mind?
What do you mean? If I hear, what's the first thing I'm...
Like, hey, did you hear that all 7 Richardson children died at the hospital? What do you think to yourself?
I would not know how to respond to that. I would think, how crazy is that? I would think it'd have been a car accident.
Well, okay, that would make sense, right? Yeah, I could go with that. A car accident. Okay, let me say it like this. All 7 Richardson children had to be rushed to the hospital. They were all DOA except one who died a little bit later.
Was there a fire?
Okay, nothing comes to mind about murder.
No.
Okay, and so...
No, 7 kids being killed. I do not jump to murder.
Okay, let's say it like this. Did you hear that the children at the Richardson house got violently ill and then all died at the hospital? What do you think?
I think lead. I think asbestos. I think what could have been in their house that could have killed them.
And
I don't think murder.
Possibly food poisoning.
Food poisoning could be a thing. Yes, I think a number of things. Murder is not it. Murder by a parent is not it. It would be extreme if it was some sort of familicide.
Right. And so to me, that's sort of where this starts down the wrong path, right?
Yeah.
Granted, it's interesting that they went after the dad.
When he really had nothing to do with it. They made a leap there that didn't even make sense.
Well, and okay, so, we don't actually know what happened. The implication would be from the hundreds of confessions that perhaps it was the babysitter because she actually had poisoned her husband.
Okay, so here's the story with her, and I think she's responsible for the something happened in another county where Klein isn't listening enough to the prosecutor and what he's saying.
Okay.
The reason I say that is because digging into her background, and this presented one case in like the summaries of this, here's what I found out about her. So first of all, she had 3 husbands. The first husband, she poisoned him. She doesn't get charged for that, but he dies after she prepares a meal that he eats. He dies.
Okay. Oh, and so nobody jumps to the conclusion that he was poisoned by a person?
Right.
Okay.
So her second husband leaves her for a cousin of James Richardson. She goes and shoots him, but she claims self-defense. She's charged. She ends up with a manslaughter charge, and she gets out on parole. So at the time this crime has happened, she is on parole for shooting her second husband after her first husband died from basically exactly what happened to these children. And I think Treadwell, because early on, Treadwell doesn't think they can prosecute this case. And I think he is telling Klein, look, there's some issues in another county related to all of this with Richardson's cousin. I think that they're not like Frank Klein's not the brightest, bulb in the bush. And while Treadwell is trying to explain it to him, I think he thinks Richardson has done something in another county and starts spitting out these stories about other dead children. I don't find any record of other dead children. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. But what I do find is that Bessie Reese appears to have killed her first husband and definitely is tried for killing her second husband who had run away. And she ends up with a motive for inflicting harm on the Richardson family because that second husband had left her for someone related to the Richardsons.
Well, I don't necessarily think that's the motive. It could be, but I would just as easily say that the neighbor de facto babysitter was tired of having to take care of another family's 7 children. She was, by all accounts, the de facto babysitter. She happened to be there. And so these kids come home from school, she's feeding them. And it seems like perhaps she was tired of doing that and decided to just go ahead and put the pesticide in the hog jowl gravy.
Right.
That she served the children on top of their rice and beans that their mother had prepared for them.
Yes.
And to me, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, she had some problems. Sometimes, especially if she had like early onset Alzheimer's, right?
Yeah.
Overreactions like poisoning children, like it doesn't quite register the gravity of the situation for people who are suffering from cognitive problems like that, right?
Yeah.
Taking out frustrations in exaggerated ways, it won't register. I don't know that that's what happened here. I do also believe, though, that it's weird that they willfully ignored her repeated confessions as her being out of her mind.
Yeah.
That's weird, right?
Yep.
Now, from a traditional crime point of view, this would be a domestic situation. I'm fairly certain, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I've ever heard of a father poisoning his children.
Poison generally tends not to be men, yeah.
Exactly. It's women. Women use poison because it's a covert and usually not messy method, right?
Correct.
Not to mention, like, especially in the 60s, like women would have control over food, right? I mean,
correct.
I say it that way. I don't really mean it. it's more like they cook the food. That's why it's amazing to me that you've got two women, one who cooked the food, the other who served the food. Women are, traditionally speaking, more likely to poison their victims, and they charge a man
Yep.
who didn't touch the food.
Yeah, this is not an area where we've lost a lot of the gene pool recently. Like in space and time, like Sheriff Frank Klein, he's not really doing a lot for the state at the time.
If you were to step back from now, or even if you're just a bystander back then, it's odd that it immediately goes to, oh, the father murdered them all.
It is weird. It's really weird.
And, if you think about this, so this was before, even Ted Bundy.
Yeah, although I will say Bessie Reese's name, if you go hunting, she's in the serial killer databases that are available on the internet where they kind of half-assed started putting things together 20 years ago. She's in there, and people recognize that she was a serial killer. They contribute...
Including these children?
Yep, they contribute 11 victims.
Who are the others?
I don't know. Just putting this story together is complicated from the perspective of, if you go read this story on the internet, I think I've given you the closest thing to the real story in what I just gave. But I had to pull it from 8 different sources that at times directly contradict each other with little details.
Right. And it gets really confusing. And I get stuck on things like when I hear the other children that he killed that died in other counties, I actually get stuck on that. And so I miss everything in between there and where I realize that didn't really happen. Right. The way that they're putting that information out there is irresponsible.
Oh, I totally agree. I wanted to cover this one from the perspective of it's a wild ride. There are some things that take place around the holidays. He does get out. I know he didn't have anything to do with it because of how all of this shook out. He had kind of a cloud hanging over his head, and I feel awful. This is a culmination of a terrible case. When you go to read the court documents, even Florida makes it kind of hard for you to get the real ones. And I know other people have covered this case out there somewhere, but the coverage that I've read of it and trying to put it all together, I kept coming across little things that were slightly wrong or slightly different and trying to get to the very bottom of it. The only thing I know for sure is that Bessie Reese was probably a serial killer.
Yeah, maybe. I think it's going to be a different kind, though. I don't think she, meticulous.
She's more of an arsenic and old lace kind of story. Do you know that story?
Yeah, I think so.
So she was known as Big Mama. She took care of kids. Arsenic and Old Lace is this old play by Joseph Kesselring. And these two little creepy women, they run this, it's like a bed and breakfast or an inn, whatever you want to call it. And ultimately, it's a lot of murder by poison. And when you watch that show, you could easily make a Southern Black version of that show, and it would read like Bessie Reese's life.
Right. And I don't know to what extent beyond these children, but I can actually, I can picture what she's like. I can picture the scenario where she is completely, sure that this is the right thing for her to be doing at the moment she's doing it.
Yeah.
And she's doing it because she's become this de facto babysitter and she can't get out of it for whatever reason. And things like this happen, but there are better ways to handle it, obviously. And she felt guilt because that's why she was confessing repeatedly.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a lot more on this one. I wanted to include it in the Home for the Holidays episodes. If you have anything else, I'm glad to chat about it a little more. But it's not a super long one. It's just a really weird one.
It is a weird case. I feel like there was a whole lot that went wrong here, and it would have been very easy to just kind of use the, I don't even know if you'd call them standards, but like, you know, the last person that was seen with the kids include somebody that had actually come into contact with the food. Yeah. Like all the like basic principles of like who killed someone, it's like they skipped right over them. And it seems like that could have saved a lot of people a lot of grief. I cannot even imagine what Joseph Richardson went through. I feel like it's almost, that is an unimaginable situation to go from, you know, having a family, working, and, you know, just having life, to losing all 7 of your children instantaneously, practically, on just a normal day, and then going to jail for it and being sentenced to death. And having not done anything.
Yeah.
It's pretty unimaginable. And I have no doubt it probably directly caused him to have the heart problems that he had.
Oh, yeah. It was definitely the reason he had a heart attack. Yep, 100%. Well, this is another one in the books. We were deep into Home for the Holidays with this one. It is an absolutely terrifying one, but we will be back with a couple more episodes between now and Christmas Day.
Special consideration was given to True Crime Excess by LabrattiCreations.com. If you have a moment in your favorite app, please go on and give us a review or a 5-star rating. It helps us get noticed in the crowd. This is True Crime XS.
The season twinkles under starry skies, and Kris Kringle's drinking cherry wine. How I wish you were here to stop my Christmas tears. Presents wrapped underneath the tree, hung the stockings up 1, 2, 3. If it could only be you here with me. I love you so, but only Christmas knows. One day it will be my baby and me. Santa's helping stringing up the lights. Winter's wonderland is just outside. How I wish you were here to stop my Christmas tears. Maybe next year we'll be holding hands. I'll be singing, you'll be making plans. If it could only be you here with me. I love you so, but only Christmas knows. One day it will be my baby and me.
True Crime Excess is brought to you by John and Meg. It's written, produced, edited, and posted by John and Meg. You can always support True Crime Excess through patreon.com, or if you have a story you'd like them to cover, you can reach them at truecrimeaccess.com. Thank you for joining us.
This is just a reminder that we are part of the Zencastr Creator Network, and I put a link in the show notes if you guys want to check it out for your own podcasting needs. I've always enjoyed using Zencastr. Their quality is great, and we were able to join their Creator Network at kind of a key time in their history. I have enjoyed it. I've considered a lot of other places to record and a lot of other ways to put together and host and distribute our podcast. But I've stuck with Zencastr the longest. We've been with them for hundreds of episodes now. And I'm putting a link in the show notes where you can check out what they have to offer and see if it's something you would want to use.